we've established a mini science center at our Alibag Leadership Center. We have a van there as well that covers most of Alibag. And then we've started a program where we get some of we fund vans for our NGOs who are located more remotely. So we have one in Chambal with an organization called Agastya, and we hope to expand that program as well and make many of our NGOs have the benefit of Agastya, and have the benefit of Agastya for their children as well, and really spread the reach of Agastya. So that's how we started, and I'd love for Deval to tell us about his association, and then Rumana and Ruchi.
Thank you, Vidya. We've been fortunate to know Mr. Ramji and Agastya, I think, for about 13 years. And so it was around 2002 or 3, I think, when we first learned about the work that they were doing. We were extremely impressed with this sort of razor-sharp focus on science education. I think in 2003, while there were many NGOs that provided support in education, Agastya was the very first one that we knew of that was actually focusing on a topic within the education space. And at that time, honestly, people were criticizing, saying, but shouldn't you look at overall education? Science itself is not the answer, you have to do everything. But I think Mr. Ramji and his team back then was saying that we will focus on this, we'll do it well. Clearly there's other aspects of education, but we will actually hone in on this, and that'll enable us to not only be experts in one area, but also enable us to scale faster. So we were fortunate to start working with them back then in terms of capacity building, thinking about scale, having conversations with him and his team about impact assessment, governance, reaching out to a larger group of philanthropists. And it's absolutely amazing for us to see where they are today and what you guys have been able to achieve since that time period. Of late, we've been working with Agastya in Gujarat, as Mr. Jalajdani was saying, and helping with some of those initiatives that are happening in rural Gujarat. But I think for us, Agastya and other organizations like them are really that inspiration or that spark that we've seen over almost 2 decades of working in the sector of, if you have focus, if you have systems, if you have a process in place, chances are you can actually impact millions of lives across the country. And for us, it's really been an honor to be working with him as well as his team for many, many years.
I was very lucky through one of our board members to be introduced to Ramji about 3 years ago. And while I haven't yet had the opportunity to go to Kuppam, I went to Bangalore and I was at a science fair, and I realized, like everyone else, I knew nothing and I remembered nothing because I had never had a process of being excited about science. And as some of you know, my uncle is a scientist, and one of his biggest challenges has been that no one wants to grow up and be a scientist anymore. People have many different aspirations, but it's not science. And Agastya made me realize that day that science is fun, science is exciting, and made me a bit jealous because kids were learning about science through Todphod, building models, a way that I never had access to, and it was such an exciting moment to be there, to see the young trainers who were talking about, building models, about the human body, and just excited, confident, energetic. And for me, that was my pinprick moment, Ramji, where I said, this is what education must be, where it gets me excited and it makes me ambitious about my own future. It shows me a world that without Agastya I would never ever have seen. And we've been really lucky across 3 units in CIPLA. We are running Agastya vans, and through their support, we reach many, many kids now who are coming to a new world. And I think that's what counts, is to give people the opportunity to see something beyond their lives. And for that, I can't thank the Agastya team enough.
So at Deutsche Bank, the quality of education that a child gets in a government school system is one of the really important pillars for us. And to ensure that we respond to that, we look at models wherein what is it that will impact that life really in the school while the child is there. Is it a good teacher? Is it a STEM education? Is it simple infrastructure in a school, or much more? In the quest of that, I think is when, I don't know if it's a chance meeting, but I'm glad that happened with Agastya about 2 years ago. It's the second year of association with Agastya. And I think the reason this is a really important initiative for Deutsche Bank is because it's really taking, like Ramji puts it, I'm stealing a few words from him, but that aha moment into these children's lives, right? And it's so important. I always tell him, and I was just telling some of the panelists, that I wish I learned science in this manner. I never got interested because I was given a book, learned from it, tells you that I went to a commerce graduation and so on. But I think it's really important, the whole idea of questioning, getting curious, and really learning from experiencing it is, I think, what excites me the most about Agastya. It's not science education, it's not math. What they're really learning is how to question, how to figure it out, how to break, how to join, and then find those answers yet again, and that's what excites us. So with Agastya now, we started 3 new science centers last year. We're supporting 6 of them this year. What is also really interesting is not just that these children go and experience what they do at these science centers, and which I'm sure you'll see through the day, but also the young leader program, and again, the young instructor leader. I don't know how much you know about it, but the fact that they identify talent from within these schools who can further help other children and their friends back in school by learning and understanding what they do, or the instructor master trainer program, which is again, I think, extreme value. So we're supporting some of that, and I'm really glad we do. The other cross collaboration that I'm really happy we're able to make with Agastya is wherever we're funding these science centers, we're able to also help children from other schools that we fund or other educational projects where we have, to bring them over to the science center. And it's amazing the kind of response that we've got in Jaipur in particular, Ramji and the Agastya team. It's been a fabulous collaboration where a lot of our other government school children have got an opportunity to go and see something that they had never had. So I'm really glad this chance meeting happened, and I'm glad what you're doing and the impact that you're creating. So please do continue doing the great work.
I think the philanthropy of all of us sort of predates the compliance angle of the CSR bill and so on and so forth. And how did that sort of change for you, for the bank, and what sort of new ways did you and the CSR leadership in the bank have to use to ensure that you were compliant, but you also maintained the spirit of philanthropy that anyway Deutsche Bank had begun its journey with?
Sure, so like you said, absolutely Vidya, Deutsche Bank has been participating in communities and giving back to its communities for a while now, and it dates back to maybe as long as Deutsche Bank has been around. I think to your point on what are the changes that the CSR Act has brought around, and I'll steal from Ramji and say it's been that pinprick moment for CSR in India, right? So we were all doing philanthropy, we were all giving back to our communities. There was a sense of response, but I think what the CSR law has done is one, change the entire giving from just a couple of people who are passionate about doing it to bringing it to the boardroom in the first place. Capacity has been one challenge, and I was talking to Deval that what we are now looking at is how can we build capacity with the smaller NGOs, because we're looking at 15 to 20,000 crores. It's an industry. It sounds harsh, but it is like an industry now. And where is the capacity to take in all this money and actually do some good work? So we are now also looking at saying how do we build capacity at the same time while we do this from a compliance perspective. How are we ensuring the spends are in the right place? Are we really creating the impact? So having launched 3 science centers, what has that really done for those 4,000, 5,000, 10,000 children who end up going into those science centers? So with that, I'll just sort of leave you to come back and see, or anyone else has any questions.
So actually that brings me to Deval, because I think, with all this 15-20,000 crores of CSR money that has, suddenly come in the limelight. It was there in some form or fashion, but it wasn't, sort of the number was not out there stark. And I've been on in many events where NGOs complain about how difficult it is to access this money. They feel that CSR organizations are very unreasonable, they want audits, they want reviews, and some of the larger NGOs have moved from working with multilaterals to working with CSRs. The younger ones just don't know how. What has been your experience on that side, since you work on both sides of the spectrum? And how have you been able to coach, or what are the few things you've told NGOs to do to be able to effectively access this money?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's definitely been, on one hand, like you were saying, a real opportunity, given the amount of the funds that have been coming, not just from the CSR lot, but a lot of the families that are running these businesses are actually giving much more than 2% of their wealth away to philanthropy now, which is fantastic and phenomenal. Simultaneously, though, just in the last 12 months, if you look at FCRA funding, it has actually dropped by 10,000 crores. So last year we got funding from abroad into India at about a 16,000 crore level. This year it's at 6,000 crores. And so it's not necessarily that there's just a lot of new funds coming in. There's also funds that are no longer coming into our country. Number one, because people realize globally that India is doing well. And we're getting closer and closer to becoming a middle income country. And so there's various governments that are saying we should not be funding in India now, we should go into countries that don't have this economic environment. So I think that it's interesting just to realize that it's just not an increase, there's also a balancing that's happening. And I think that's very difficult, clearly, for any organization. I think another sort of area that is currently being worked on, I would say, is most of these older funders, whether they're from abroad or even in India, have been giving for many, many years. And so their experience in giving was that of taking 5-year bets, 10-year bets, thinking about behavioral change, thinking about the intangibles, realizing the need and the sort of the desire of these organizations to build strong relationships first, create behavioral change, and then implement programs, not just sort of knee-jerk. And I think, unfortunately, the law and how it was seen to begin with was very much about 1-year impact. And I think that's made it difficult for just many individuals who've never even been in this space, who don't have PhDs in education or women's empowerment or agriculture. All of a sudden, along with 4 other jobs, they're now looking at this as well. And so they're trying to, because of their own business compliance norms, sort of copy and paste exact business sort of processes. And I think that's hard to do when you're creating sectors. And so I think a lot of these NGOs, their complaints are valid because it's going to take time for that sort of sophistication to occur. And so what we try to do, and this is difficult because I think all NGOs, including Agastya, which has achieved so much, are short in terms of human talent. And so what we're talking to NGOs about is how they can sort of start educating these funders, not necessarily to get money, but really to help them understand on it's a 5 to 10 year horizon. We may need money for management because that's actually critical to ensure we're not embezzling, to ensure we can do 26 reports if that's required for the donor. And so really helping the NGOs to educate the donors as they have done so successfully in educating the communities that they're trying to serve. And so I think on one hand, NGOs have a phenomenal capability, for example, with Agastya, in ensuring that the communities who may have not looked at science as an area of focus very quickly, through what we're seeing upstairs, through patience, through a lot of rigor, are convincing and changing behaviors in the community. Unfortunately, now NGOs are placed in that same position to say they have to have that same patience with corporates now, who may not have these skills or the requisites, and really help them and take them through this journey, realizing it is sort of a difficult period, but hopefully in a couple of years, that knowledge will be transferred. And just like investing long-term funding, looking at management cost, being a real partner again with everyone on this stage is doing, but I think more corporates need to sort of get to that level versus saying, what is a science fair going to do in making a child in 4th grade become a doctor in the next year? And that's just not possible to quantify.
Rumana, your journey in philanthropy has been very, very interesting because you actually started as a filmmaker, right? And then you've sort of made a very interesting turn. And also, CIPLA as an organization has decades of history in giving, in palliative care, in HIV/AIDS. There's so much work that's gone before. And then a lot of work in some of the remoter parts of the country and internationally because of CIPLA's presence, both in terms of manufacturing as well as in terms of reach. So as somebody who's intrinsically part of CIPLA but has come in kind of from the outside into philanthropy, how are you seeing CIPLA change? What is it that you want to do in terms of shaping the future of philanthropy within the group?
Thanks, Vidya. It's true, I was a filmmaker and spent 5 years on one single documentary called Fire in the Blood, which dealt with the politics of access to medicine. And I saw the extraordinary journey not only CIPLA but many other people made to make medicines both accessible and affordable. And I realized that I didn't want to be on that side of the camera. I actually wanted to get in and see whether I could be part of the solution. What I admire about CIPLA is that it's a corporate that has, escaped the tyranny of numbers, where it's kept the patient at the heart of everything that we do. And actually the patient is not our consumer, because our 1,200 products are theoretically by prescription. So the doctor is our consumer. But we've been told over and over again, not just by our founders, but by our current CEO, keep the patient at the heart of everything. Make sure that medicines continue to be accessible. And that's not easy in today's world. There is a lot of pressure to change that model. And I think that having grown up in a family and working for a company that's business ethic is consistent with equality and accessibility, the foundation actually is always playing catch up. We are held to a higher standard because we are told that it's not about the 2%, it's about these are the amount of people that you have a responsibility to, both as a family and as a company, and go out there and make partnerships. And I haven't found actually, Deval, a lot of conundrum between NGOs that we work with, because I find that on both sides, people are really happy to come together and share skills. There's so much we don't know about frontline work and how to actually make change happen. And we can bring some skills in forecasting or budgeting, capacity building that as a company we've been doing for over 80 years. So I think it's a really exciting time for corporates, NGOs, civil society, the government to actually sit on the same table and make societal change, because we are all working in our individual way to do the best that we can. And it's an inflection point. I think India is ready to move forward. I don't know whether we're going to be a middle-income country, but but certainly I think that if we go towards a true spirit of partnership, there's nothing we can't do.
I'll just have one more round of questions, Ali, and then we can open it up. So Ruchi, if you could tell us about, again, how Deutsche Bank is looking at its education portfolio, how Agastya sort of fits into that, and what do you see, especially from the bank's strategy in education from a philanthropy point of view, and how it sort of also mixes in with the bank itself and your own business philosophy.
Sure. Thanks, Vidya. So first to Agastya, I think like I mentioned, within our education vertical, we were clear when we were taking up or looking up projects to say it has to clearly be something that is impacting that life of that child in the school. And what does that mean, really? That let's just step back for a second and say, when we talk about that child's life cycle in the school, it's right from access to basic infrastructure, and to actually to step back a little bit. First of all, access to going to school in some cases, and I know we're all sitting in Mumbai, and it sounds like how can there really be an issue with access to school? And there's actually we work in an area called Govandi in Mumbai, and where there are actually groups of people from the rag-picking community whose children have never been to school because one, they're all migrated into Mumbai through some manner, and they don't even have the requisite the cards, ration card, etc. So the children don't even make it to school. So anyway, to give you an example, one, even that access to children, and every child, in my view, should at least get some formal education and go to school. So access to the school. Two is infrastructure within the school. Three, the quality of teaching again on what happens in the school once he lands up over there. What are they going to end up learning? Four, again, focus on, while it's quality and you may call it a subset, but how are you exciting the child with either its digital education or any forms of so much technology that has now taken place? The education, if I may call the vertical, only getting stronger and focusing more and more on clear outcomes on what next. So you've created that access to the science center and you've built that library in the school and all of that, the teachers there in the school. But what's next? So you've solved the problem for the next year, and I would say, like a guilty corporate, we only fund for a year and keep renewing our projects because of our global policies. But with the clear intent that we're trying to see what change are we trying to bring in 3 to 5 years. So when we do take up partnerships with Agastya included, although it's for a year, the intent is we want to build this in 3 to 5 years and go to the root cause and fund the root cause to say what problem it is really solving.
Thanks, Ruchi. I think Deval, you've been in this space for almost 18 years now, and you've seen corporates who've been more forward-looking, and there are the newer ones who are just getting into philanthropy or CSR who are struggling with figuring out how do you look beyond a year, how do you actually, I think one of our early questions from our own investment committee about Agastya was how do you really measure impact, Can you go back and check whether their math and English grades went up? So I'm sure you get questions like these a lot. And what has been sort of your education of philanthropists in how they should look at pushing initiatives like Agastya, maybe pushing really key initiatives in more remote locations that may not be easy to measure?
Yeah, no, I think it's, first of all, I think what we've seen with the corporate sector, they rely on research and facts, and so we have about 80 research reports available online on different sectors, just helping individuals understand who are the players, what are the interventions, what is government doing, what's corporate sector doing, what is philanthropists doing, where can you sort of create impact with communities you're trying to serve. And so I think number one, a lot of that knowledge is just not that readily available. But I think what we've seen, at least in working with givers, is if you're able to spend, like we have in each of these reports, about 9 months speaking to about 300 organizations, experts, government officials, etc., and printing between a 50 to 100 page report on this, that knowledge allows at least the funder to start understanding the intricacies about the sector, the complexities of what change actually means. And so even in education, for example, while many people attribute education to the creation of their wealth, there's probably 100 different things you can do within education. And you have to be clear as a giver which one or two or three of those 100 things you want, because many times we saw, at least, where people would be funding education programs, 3 years later would say, oh, well, these people that are being educated, the students don't even speak English yet. And the NGO themselves said that we weren't even talking about English, we're working in Marathi medium schools. We're improving the quality of education there. So just helping, I think, the donor identify their theory of change through knowledge, I think, is critical. And NGOs are forced to do this on a regular basis. What's their vision, the mission? And we try to help donors articulate that. And then I think once they're able to articulate that, then find organizations that match their theory of change, versus many times what happens is, I trust this individual, he's in the education space, how about I have them implement my theory of change? And while that can be possible, that takes a much longer period of time. That's a risk that you have to entail. And so just helping, again, these philanthropists realize if you want somebody to do something that they haven't done in the last 15 years, you probably need to make a 5 to 10 year commitment. You have to let them make mistakes, and you have to let them innovate, versus trusting them because they've been in the community before that time period. So I think, again, if you're sharing this data, you're making these site visits, you're helping them see on the ground what's happening, and I think more importantly, and I think Mr. Jalajdani talked about this as well, many of these individuals don't even know what Govindi is, for example. And so also when you go to these communities and you realize, I believe the life expectancy in Govindi, which is here in Mumbai, is 39 years. And that's Mumbai. And so when you go to a community like that, you realize that maybe certain things that we think about as success may take another generation in Govindi, and we should first look at basic rights and skills. And so I think it's only when you see the communities, you see what you're up against, then I think you're able to actually understand what the NGO is battling with and what can be measured and what can't be measured. But that exposure, I think, is critical, and then understanding of what else is occurring across the country and maybe even globally, just so you have that insight.
Can I just add, Vidya, I think it's a really thin line when you talk about impact in the education space, right? So I think from our perspective in health and water, it's very clear. You've given money for a child's, operation and they're cured, done, impact. Water availability, hence more yield on productivity, done, impact. With education, and like the reason I'm saying it's a thin line is you end up going back to a lot of quantitative impact numbers to say, oh, so what are the SR scores now? So what were they last year? And I find myself asking those questions. And then I wonder, what am I doing here? So is that the only way to measure, to say the SR scores last year and this year? To maybe Ramji and Hariad go back and say the math and the science scores last year or this year? And then you wonder, is that the only metric that you want to measure impact on? Or is it really beyond that and more anecdotal to say that what you're creating is a much more long-lasting impact, which you may see and may not be able to still measure in 8 to 10 years, but it's not a year on year to say, give me numbers on wow, what has happened, and to show up on a slide. So I don't know, it's a very, very thin line, I agree.
Yeah, and so I'll have Rumana have the final word, but I think, this is something that I think all of us face, because it's great to intrinsically believe that no change happens without a 10-year, maybe 15-year journey. Some of the more difficult work around rights and empowerment, it takes generations. But nevertheless, you have a board to report to. They're giving you the money. You're accountable for it. So have you had any sort of fights and battles in the boardroom and trying to, sort of convince your way to a bunch of people who are very business-minded, or you had a very different experience?
Well, I am very fortunate to have a board who understands the complexities of health to start with, and that there's no easy fix. So when we go in, my colleagues and me, to present the work we have done, and we're not discussing return on investment. We are discussing partnerships, vulnerable communities, and actually something my team and I have made a commitment to is we don't talk about impact. We don't talk about, because I don't think that we're at a point where at least our foundation is very small and our reach is limited. So we talk about activities. And for us then, Agastya was great, because we found a partner that was talking about mapping activities, mapping exposure visits, and letting that do its magic, rather than quantifying what the kid did in his 10th grade and did he become a scientist, because that was not the point. The point was each exposure visit to an Agastya science fair, lab on the bike, enriching both for the teacher and the student? And there you have the Agastya folks on the ground making sure it happens in real time. And we have some of our CIPLA Foundation members here who are, partners on the ground in Patal Ganga, in Goa, in Bangalore, out there with the Agastya teams in these schools, working together to see whether Agastya can open possibilities. And I think that's what, at least for CIPLA Foundation, drew us to Agastya, because we were talking about a future that we couldn't see, and we didn't want to quantify. And we don't quantify our work because it's not possible. 8,000 exposure visits gives you what? There's no way of knowing that. But I think that for every young trainer who goes on to have a college education and change the world, you know, that's real change. And I think that life is not about statistics. Every life matters. Success cannot be measured by numbers. And for us, that's why our partnership with Agastya works. And it works really well on the field. And not to say that we don't have our differences, and Hamied and Ramji have not sat together and talked about quality and, you know, how do we bring in, you know, scope of work, how do we change it, what's our MOU together, and how can we continue to help each other. I think that's where we sit, not across from each other, but with each other, trying to understand frontline work, because we're with them on the front line, realizing that let's measure our activity, let's be faithful to the schools we go to, and the future will take care of itself. So that's where my board has luckily, you know, been a partner on that. And this year, CIPLA Foundation will make 2%, but no one is worried about that. Everyone's worried about what's the work you did, and how did you do it, and what's the next thing. And so I'm fortunate, and I hope other corporates can join us in that journey.
Yeah, on that perfect note, I think I wanted to say here, but thank you so much. Thank you.
I work in Agastya as I'm called Director Capacity Building. I've also had a very long background of working with NGOs. So basically it is to say that what the panel's been saying is was music to my ears. Whether it was the 5-year window that Deval talked about, or the metrics that Ruchi talked about, or Rumana saying that, you know, how do we measure? And of course, Vidya, what you said. My point here, I just like to bring something on the table, which, you know, I have in my previous work spent a lot of time talking about how much time do we give to processes and how do we show accountability to the funders. It has to be a mix of the two. So one of the things that we have done in Agastya over the last 5 years, which you are probably all aware of, is if we say an exposure, or we say that our instructors spend so much time with the children, we have tried through the Instructor Master Trainer program, which Deutsche Bank initially funded, and the subsequent quality assurance program, which we are doing internally, we have tried to see that every exposure really counts. And I think bringing a structure into that, which we've spent a lot of time doing in the last 5 years, and setting up a team for that and all that, I think that has helped a lot in the way Agastya has grown, and also helped us ensure some kind of accountability. And we try to look at it primarily accountability to the children. So say that 2 hours that they've spent with our instructor, what is the journey giving the kids? So we've tried to structure that, and I think that has gone pretty well in the way, you know, helped us to expand, and also helped us to have some internal metrics, which, you know, builds accountability. So that's something I wanted to share rather than a question. And again, to reiterate that the panel was absolute music to my ears.
Sharing your insights. And you know, when we first started Agastya, the first year or 2 after we acquired the land to build the campus, my father was still alive then. And I remember showing him a graph of the grades of the children in Kuppam. It was kind of naive at the time. And how their grades in science had been going up. So I proudly showed it to my father. And he said, look, I doubt very much that you can take credit for that, assuming it means anything. At best, I think what you guys must have done is, because you've shown that you care for these kids, you've raised their self-belief and motivation, a la Maunika. And what you're seeing is, because their motivation changed, they're studying harder and maybe their grades have gone up. Right? So firstly, whether it's the right thing to look at, that's a question. I would tend to agree with Rumana, but I've got to be careful what I say, because as Deval was saying, there's such a sort of conventional wisdom about the need to put a number on everything, right? So that's one. The second is my friend Pankaj Chandra, who runs Ahmedabad University and is trying to create a new sort of educational paradigm there, and who was director of the IIM in Bangalore. And obviously full of metrics and measurement and so on. He came up to me one day and said, Ramji, you know, I've changed my thinking on education. I visited a couple of kids in Ahmedabad, went to their home and saw the conditions they were living in and the sort of challenges they have. And it struck me all of a sudden that all this measurement and metrics and all is almost irrelevant. India hasn't invested in education for a couple of centuries. Now, what we need to do is, assuming we get it broadly right in terms of the inputs, and let's focus on this, let's focus on that, we just have to invest like crazy for a long, sustained period of time to make up for that. And to say that I will only spend at the margin another rupee or a dollar till you show me a kid who's got into college or who's got, 85% and moved up to 90 is almost, stupid. So it depends what you're trying to do. The challenge, one of the challenges that Agastya faces is, I do talk, like she was saying, after Agastya went there, her kids are getting into medical college and taking careers in science. I wasn't even aware of it. The moment I start documenting that, the people in Agastya will start focusing on that. Okay? And then you can slowly kiss goodbye to all the other stuff, like curiosity and creativity. You'll be saying, how many kids got into medical college? Now, we have actually dimensioned that in Kuppam, these young instructor leaders, how many of them have got into college? And what we have found is 90%. And the Indian average is some 22%, the Andhra average. Now, this is easy to relate to. And even I I'm looking at that graph now. But we've got to be very, very careful that I think if you've got the right inputs, activities, and a sense of how it might be impacting a child's life and how they sort of progress, that's far more valuable than saying, the marks have gone up from 80 to 85%. You don't need a square wheel cycle on the second floor to do all that. You may as well set up a tutoring college. And maybe, that's the thing to do, but I want no part of that. So your insights and perspectives are really, and a lot of corporates, maybe it's the backgrounds they come from. We're all part of the system. So you want to apply that and say, so this is a bit of a mutual education game that's going on.
In Dharavi, it's a remote place, as you all know, it's a slum area. We have a lot of deprived children, and when Agastya Foundation comes and they start working with those children, their curiosities are so much, but we can't provide them because we have limitations, resource limitation. As he said, money, power, we don't have. We are aided schools. Government has made it we don't have any non-salary grants now. So running a school becomes very, very difficult. My question is that there is a government GR also, Pragat Maharashtra, where they said that the schools have to approach the corporates and get funds. We have to make digital classrooms. That is a challenge for us now. And when we go to the corporates people, they say that you should have, there is a lot of lengthy process, which as an academics, I have no idea about the process. So I'm lost over there. And they say that our board has decided that we are going to give funds only to this. And already it has been decided. So how am I to approach them? The process is difficult one. Yes, we do have a presentation, everything we are ready to do. But approaching them becomes a difficult task for us.
I think Rumana sort of hinted on about partnerships and everyone working together. I think the abilities that you guys have, so first of all, you run a school, right? And that's more than, for example, what many organizations do. Even Agastya, for example, runs science fairs, but not schools. And so in Agastya's sort of core, it is partnering with existing educational institutions. And I think on the flip side, the same way that you, for example, in this particular case, and I'm sure there's many, I think reaching out to organizations like Olympic Gold Quest, for example, that provides training, even Mr. Jalajdani is now looking at Sports for Excellence and others. So partnering with others who maybe have the resources to go out and look at digital labs or to create some of this at a broader basis, and working with them to see if you guys can in partnership approach some of these corporates, I think may be a better way of doing it, because you may not even have the legal registrations that are required for a corporate to give you money.
No, we have a trust deed, we have a
12A, ATG, but yeah, so I mean, I think there's programs there's Atma Mumbai, for example, that Ruchi and Deutsche Bank and others use that provide capacity building support to educational organizations, helping them both with their strategies as well as raise capital. So there's groups that exist that do this work, but I think it is definitely difficult, because a lot of times, again, they expect schools to focus on these areas versus running the school, which is hard. And there's no real easy answer, I think, to a lot of these things.